I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is Vincent Prager, founder of the Oppenheimer-Prager Museum at Dayspring in St. Andrews. Thank you for being here today, Vincent.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, for people who haven't visited your museum, it is a very special and magical place. How do you explain it to someone who's never been there before, though?
It's complicated because I always tell people it's a combination of about 300 works of art painted by my mother and my grandfather, but there's also the location of the museum, which is the former home of Lady Beaverbrook, which in and of itself is a tourist attraction in a way. And we have other things there other than the paintings. We've got jewelry, we've got interesting correspondence, letters, there's some classic cars, there are toys for kids, because my mother collected toys all her life. And so it's a series of everything. It's something for everybody, is basically what I would say.
Let's talk a little bit about your grandfather, Joseph Oppenheimer. Pretty established artist in his own right, one of the founders of, I believe, the German Impressionist movement?
Yeah, it's called the Berlin Secession.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is that in terms of being a movement?
Well, it was a movement that started at the very end of the 19th century, first few years of the 20th, and they were the equivalent of the French Impressionist school, but they organized exhibitions in Berlin, and my grandfather, who was living in Berlin at the time, he had traveled to the States. He met, among other people, John Singer Sargent. He painted some of the same people that Sargent painted, and he actually was responsible to get Sargent to exhibit at the first Berlin Secession. And at my home in Montreal, I actually have a painting by my grandfather, which was exhibited at that exhibition. So it was a fairly important organization, and it's still now becoming more and more recognized in Germany.
He was renowned for his portraits as well, and one of his friends and subjects, Albert Einstein. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship and also some of the artifacts from that relationship that you can see at the museum?
Well, one artifact is me, because my grandfather and my grandmother were friendly with the Einsteins as a result of my grandfather having painted him in about 1931, 32, somewhere around there. And the Einsteins invited my grandparents for tea one day, where they had a cottage outside of Berlin in a forest, and my grandparents were allowed to bring my mother and her brother with them, and they were walking through the forest to get to the Einstein house. And the house before the Einstein house, there were three guys playing chamber music on the balcony, and one of them was my dad, who played the piano. And my mother looked up and saw my dad, and he looked down at her, and that was where they first met. Wow. And that evening they went to the movies, and they saw each other again. And that evening my dad told his dad that that was the girl he was going to marry. So had it not been for the Einsteins, I wouldn't be here. But we also have, in the museum, we've got the picture, some of the sketches that my grandfather did of Einstein. He did a couple of portraits. One of them is lost. We don't know where it is. My mother chose to paint it based on photographs. So the original of that is there. And also there's a letter from Einstein to my grandfather, on which my grandfather scribbled all over the place with comments, but that's there too. But that was from the time that Einstein was already in Princeton in New Jersey.
Wow, and I know you would have been young when Einstein was still around, but did you ever have a chance to meet him?
No, I never did, but it's one of these things that you remember. I remember walking somewhere in New York on a street with my grandmother. We were going to have lunch somewhere, and she saw, there was a newsstand at the corner, and Einstein had died. And it's one of these things that you don't forget. So I remember more or less where we were when she saw that and told me who he was and what he was all about. But I was quite young. I can't remember now when he died. I must have been about 14 or 15, I guess.
How did your mother become a painter? It must have been intimidating to have such a famous father in the arts and to follow in his footsteps.
Well, I think she was very fond, obviously, of him, and her initial training as an artist came from him, but then she studied professionally, and at one point she even studied under Chagall in Paris and was living in the apartment of Chagall's daughter, Ida. And but their style of painting has some similarity, but not a great deal, and the colors are quite different. But she I think always strove to do her best so that he would be proud of her.
And speaking of your mom's use of color, that's one of the things I remember most from looking at her paintings. How do you describe her style and how does it differ from her father's style?
I think my mother's style is more feminine, and my grandfather's was more solid. She uses maybe lighter color, a lighter palette, and more pastel-y colors. My grandfather also used a lot of colors. He loved painting flowers and a lot of landscapes in addition to portraits. Something I remember when we first started organizing the foundation, and there were some exhibitions in Germany and in England, and one of the people we have a book that we published, which we still have a few copies available for sale at the museum, but in one of the ladies who wrote one of the biographies about my grandfather, he said that his great skill was that he painted in an impressionistic style, except for the face of whoever it was that he was painting. So it was a very representational face of the person, but surrounding it was a very impressionistic painting, and that was where he was quite unique in his style.
Mm-hmm. Both your grandfather and your mother had quite interesting social circles that allowed them to paint very famous faces from both sides of the Atlantic, different realms in history. What are some of the paintings you can see of people at the museum that are standouts and ones that people want to see?
Well, you're right. Since we're in St. Andrews, one of the pictures that is on display is my mother was commissioned to do a portrait of Marc Garneau, who's now our Minister of Foreign Affairs and is also my local Montreal MP, but he was the astronaut before that, and the picture that my mother did, and then she did a second one, which is the one that we have on display, but that was actually painted at Dayspring, and he was staying at I think it's the Seaside Cottages. He was staying there, and I didn't realize his mother comes from St. Andrews. So there's a local connection there. So we have, there's also several pictures of the Trudeau family, in particular Justin and Pierre. There's a fantastic picture of the four faces of Pierre Trudeau, which has been reproduced quite often. That's there. There are pictures of Adrian Clarkson, the Governor General, who my mother knew when she was still working at the CBC before she got into being the Governor General. And in fact, when my mother became an officer of the Order of Canada, it was the first investiture of Adrian Clarkson. So that my mother was very happy with. There's a portrait of Celia Franca, who was the National Ballet, I think it was, in Toronto. And there are just lots of different people there. My grandfather painted Piatigorsky, the famous cellist. There's an author, Merrill Dennison. They're just people everywhere. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of sketches, actually, of Chagall as well that he did.
Your mother had a really interesting career. I think when we look back on artists, we forget that they actually exist as working and in a context of a day-to-day life, too. But she worked for Chatelaine, Holt Renfrew. She was really established back in her time as an artist, but as a commercial artist as well.
Well, she did, at the beginning, she did a lot of commercial art, and I brought down some more of the archives that we have in Montreal, and I was going through them while I was in my 2-week quarantine, and I found all sorts of little commercial drawings that she did going back to the 1930s when she was barely 20 years old, and when they were still living in Germany. And there's some just amazing little sketches, and so I try to find something interesting to use as a Christmas card every year, and so I found more ammunition for the next few years, and I found Christmas cards going back to the 1930s and other stuff that she did for Weekend Magazine, for as you say, for different publications as well, and for Holt Renfrew. And once the COVID stuff is over, and we want to open up at least half of the upstairs of the museum, but we haven't been able to do it for the last couple of years because we need to install different lighting and finish the space where we can hang things and show exhibits, and that hasn't been possible. So there's still new things this year, but next year maybe even more.
I'd love to find out the connection. So your grandfather was born in Berlin, and your mother?
No, my grandfather was born in Würzburg, which is near Frankfurt. It's right in the heart of the wine country in Germany. My mother was born in Berlin, as was my father, and I was born in London.
And then how did you end up in Montreal, and then eventually to have this museum in St. Andrews at the former home of Lady Beaverbrook?
Well, I was born just outside of London. My parents, after the war, felt that the future for their little kid was better in North America, and they loved Canada. And my father's business, he had a company that manufactured those little English coats with the velvet collars around them and everything. And he would travel to Canada and the States a couple of times every year. But England after the war was not in great shape, so they decided in 1949 to move here. And so we moved to Montreal, and we left England on July 19th and arrived on July 26th, 1949. And so I had basically most of my schooling in Montreal. I went to boarding school in Port Hope, Ontario, but then I went to McGill. When I was at McGill, one of the people I knew was a guy called Tim Aiken, who was one of the grandsons of Lord Beaverbrook. And we were friends, not great friends, but we were friends enough that when we left university, I would still call him when I was in London and stuff like that. And at one point, he needed a Canadian to be on the board of the Beaverbrook Canadian Foundation, and he asked me whether I would take on that task, and that must have been, well, it must be getting on for probably more than 30 years. Yeah, it must be more than 30 years ago. And through that, and we do an awful lot, mainly here in New Brunswick, actually, but we've also been a big supporter of the Canadian War Museum, the Vimy Foundation, and McGill University, and the UNB. And anyway, I was, as part of being on the foundation, I was on the board of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, and we were having a meeting in 1995, just about this time, sort of mid-June 1995. And that was the year that Quebec was having the referendum. And so everybody was a little bit nervous as to what might happen. And the lady who was the head of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery at the time, we had this meeting, and I remember it was on a Monday, and it was a gorgeous, beautiful, sunny day. And the meeting was very quick, and then I had basically the rest of the day before I had to fly back. And she said, you know, you ought to go to St. Andrews, and you ought to buy some property in New Brunswick because you come here all the time. And so I thought, well, it's a nice day. I've never been to St. Andrews, which I'd never been here. And so there was a friend of hers who had been a minister in the government and was getting divorced, and they were building a A-frame house somewhere in Beauquebec. And she said, well, maybe, you know, they have to sell it, and maybe you'd like to buy it. So she organized for me to drive down and meet him. So I came down, I met him somewhere near Tim Hortons place, so that before you really got into St. Andrews. And then we went out of town to look at this house, which was one of these places where there's not one single thing that was right about this place. It was dreadful. Anyway, so I came back, and then I thought, well, I still have a couple of hours before I need to get back to take the flight. And so I said, well, I'd like to see St. Andrews. And he said, well, don't you want to see Dayspring? And I'd vaguely heard of Dayspring through the foundation because we dealt with the executor of Lady Beaverbrook's estate. But there was no love lost between her and the Aiken family because she was the second wife, and second wives don't like the kids of the first marriage, and so there was a bit of a problem. But anyway, so I said, okay, sure. So we drove up, and the house had just come up Dayspring had just come up for sale a few weeks before, and there was a big sign saying, there was the big wall around the property, so you couldn't even see it, and everything was locked tight. There was no doorbell. In the wall, and there was a big sign saying you could only see the house one at a time, and only with a bank reference letter and this and that. So anyway, this guy who I've forgotten his name, he knocked on the door and nothing happened. So then we got back in the car, and just as we were about to drive off, the door opened, and I think it was one of the gardeners came out, and he said, "Oh, this is Mr. Prager, and he's with the Beaverbrook Canadian Foundation." So they said, "Wait a minute," closed the door, of course, heaven forbid I should go in otherwise. And then the famous Dr. McLeod, the veterinarian, came out and he showed me around, and I was just amazed at this property. And when we were talking and I was making idle chatting, I had no idea how many millions they were going to ask for this place. But when I asked him, the price was just crazy, even by Montreal standards, which were very low at that time because of the referendum. So, and as I said before, it was on a Monday. I know it was on a Monday because I then thought, well, I can't believe this place is so inexpensive. And so then on the Tuesday, I called the guy who was the executor, and I said, is that really the price? Oh, yeah. And I said, well, I don't really think I want it, but I'd like to see the listing. So could you send me the listing? So I got the listing on the Wednesday, and so I looked at it and I thought, well, I've got to get this out of my system. So I called him back on the Thursday and I said, well, I can't come down this weekend because I had some friends coming, but I could come the following weekend. I knew I was going down to Massachusetts because we used to go to Rockport, which is north of Boston, and I was driving down there, and I said I could come the following weekend. And because I'm connected with the foundation, is there any way you could sort of put the place on hold? And he said, no, we can't do that, but don't worry, it's only just come up, and properties don't sell fast in St. Andrews right now, and don't worry about it. So I said, okay. So that was Thursday, and then I thought about it, and I thought, nah, I don't like that. I don't mind not buying it, but I don't want to not buy it because somebody else got it before I had a chance to say I don't want it. So I called him back on the Friday, and I said, okay, I can't come Saturday, but I could come on Sunday for the day. So I flew down on the Sunday morning. And when I was there the first time, I still hadn't seen St. Andrews because I ran out of time. The same thing happened on the Sunday. I never got to see downtown St. Andrews, but I spent a few hours looking around the place, came back Sunday night, made an offer on the Monday, which they accepted, and the next day they got a higher offer. So my instincts were right that I should hurry up. And so that's how I ended up getting the property. And I lived there until about 2010 or 11 or something. And I had a right of first refusal on the house next door, which is where the vet and his wife lived. And so when Ruth McLeod died, I had a right of first refusal. And to everybody's surprise, they got 2 unsolicited offers the same week that she died. Wow. So I ended up saying, okay, I better do that. And so I got hold of it. And then I had 2 houses. And both my mother and my grandfather always wanted to keep as much of their collection together that they didn't sell to earn their living. And so I thought, the way that Dayspring is laid out is perfect as a museum. And so in the end, I moved next door because we turned it into a museum. I'm not allowed to live there anymore. Yeah. So I now live next door. And that's
what was the vet's house? In the
vet's house. But I bought the place originally, Dayspring, without having ever seen downtown St. Andrews.
And you've since grown to love it.
Very much so.
Can we talk a little bit about, for instance, Lady Beaverbrook? What has turning it into a museum? It must to have something that's the property of someone so famous like her. What have you learned about her from occupying that property, and even knowing that her vet lived next door?
Well, I've learned a lot about her. I do know that my grandparents knew her a little bit anyway, because she and my grandparents were the only people I knew who would spend their winters in Canada and their summers in England, which seems very counterintuitive, except that England in the 1950s and 60s, they didn't have proper central heating. They had this terrible green smog or fog in the winter, and it was not healthy for people. Even if people couldn't, it wasn't that people couldn't afford central heating; they couldn't get it. It just wasn't something that you could get. So they both did the autumn trip to Canada and the spring trip back to the UK. And I know that they traveled on a couple of occasions, my grandparents with Lady Beaverbrook, so they got to know her and she was a very reclusive lady. And talking to Ruth McLeod, the vet's wife, I mean, I discovered quite how reclusive she was and all these strange things. One of the provisions in her original will was that Dayspring was to be torn down on her death because she didn't want anything personal to her to survive her death. She had inherited the house from Sir James Dunn when he died, and although she started off as his secretary and then eventually married him, she wouldn't even go out with him until he had taught her how to do wisely in investments. And at the end, I mean, she saved his company, which was Algoma Steel, on several occasions. And when he died, she was actually worth more than he was. So his money went to different charities and to his kids. Well, she just got Dayspring, and she kept that when she married Beaverbrook as well, and then kept it all her life until she died in 1994, which is the year before I bought the place. But she left in 1990. I mean, she was a pretty formidable lady. She did a huge amount for the town of St. Andrews, including building the building that we're sitting in right now. But in around 1990, the Algonquin was planning their addition, and she was very concerned about privacy, and she was convinced somehow that when the new annex was built that people could look into the garden at Dayspring. And she asked the town and asked the Algonquin if they could move it and put it somewhere else, and they just sort of said, you know, basically go to hell. And so she just packed up and left. And it makes me so, well, maybe it was good in the end, but for me, because I got the place, but all they had to do was show her a site plan, and she would have seen from the way that the land is structured that you cannot possibly see into any part of Dayspring from the hotel. So the whole thing was a complete misunderstanding, but she took away all the funding and left in 1990. But the house was maintained until the day I took over, as if she was coming back the next day. So had the house been in disrepair, it would have been an impossible thing to buy because it would have been too expensive to restore and renovate. But everything was perfect. And in the almost 30 years that I've had it, we've done basically nothing on the interior. We had to replace the roof, but otherwise there's been almost no major expenses. It's been just keep everything up to date and maintenance rather than restoration.
It is what I do love about visiting your museum is that you see these amazing paintings and really get a sense of your grandfather and your mother, but also Lady Beaverbrook, to be in that home gives you insight into her life as well.
Yeah. We have a few photos and memorabilia of her, but again, because she wanted everything destroyed, there's very little there, but we have some interesting photos and found a few other little odds and ends and
her Land Rover?
And yes, the Land Rover. I'll come to that in a second. But the other thing is we're convinced that her ghost is around there sometime, because people have actually experienced ghosts, as have I, and so, but it's a friendly ghost. I think it must be her, and she must be in a good mood because the ghostly appearances have been very friendly. But 2 years ago, Blair Thompson, who used to work at Dayspring, first for 20-something years for her and then for a few years for me, he mentioned, not quite 2 years ago, he said, you know that Lady Beaverbrook's Land Rover is not far away from here. And I said, well, I didn't even know she had a Land Rover, but in 1956 she bought one of the original Series 1 Land Rovers from England for Sir James Dunn, and it came over. We have all the records of the ship it came on and everything, and it was sitting in a garage not very far from here, and I think I probably paid too much for it, but anyway, we got it and brought it back to its original home, and it's completely original. And I've been told by people, you know, don't paint it or don't do anything, keep it just as is. But it's only got like 12 or 13,000 miles on it, and it's not being used very much, but it's nice, and so we have that on display.
Along with other vintage cars.
Some other cars. There's a car that's an old standard 14 Woody, which is a British car, and they did a one-off Woody station wagon body on the chassis, and I bought that That was my 50th birthday present to myself. And I got that in England and brought it back, so that's on display. And a few months ago, there was an auction, and I was able indirectly to get the identical model of Standard to the Woody, except that it's a convertible. And it was also, it's not only a one-off, there are others of them, but not many. And it was all coach built, so it's a 3-position convertible top, also 1947 Standard, and that's on show with some of the other cars, an Avanti convertible and a Rolls Royce and Corvette and a couple of other cars as well.
Well, I look forward to coming to visit this summer once again. The Oppenheimer-Prager Museum at Dayspring, it is a must visit. I feel like it should spark inspiration for a Wes Anderson movie. That's how I feel when I'm there. Can you tell people how to visit, just for our final words of this show?
Yes, we welcome anybody. The museum is completely self-financing, so the more people that come, the better it is. We have two guides this summer who are students who were part of the New Brunswick seed program, so that's good. That at least gets covered by the taxpayers of New Brunswick, so thank you. But we're open from Wednesday to Sunday every week from 10 till 4, and Mondays and Tuesdays we can be open if we know about it ahead of time. It's always possible, and we'll be open. We opened last week, and we're open now until probably the end of September.
Great.
And we would welcome everybody.
Well, thank you for being here today, Vincent. My guest today has been Vincent Prager of the Oppenheimer-Prager Museum at Dayspring in St. Andrews by the Sea. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.